Scream versus A Nightmare on Elm Street, which is the better movie? Hey there guys, and welcome back to Dino Reviews. It has definitely been a minute since my last video, but I wanted to jump back here and actually go through another versus movie. This time we are looking at probably Wes Craven's most iconic movies, A Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream. Now remember guys, as always, this is just my own personal opinion. If you have your own version of which movie you think is better, make sure you let me know in the comments down below. We're going to kick things off with the story of both movies. For me, looking at A Nightmare on Elm Street, what I actually really enjoy about the story is just kind of how original it is compared to all the other horror movies that had come out around that time. It has a brilliant concept with these characters, these kids of Elm Street, being stalked and murdered in their dreams by Freddy Krueger. What's great about A Nightmare on Elm Street is just how terrifying the entire concept is, that this character can kill you in your dreams. Immediately, it kind of makes Freddy Krueger this character who can completely control the narrative of the story compared to other characters like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees. Freddy instead, he kind of has his own domain and he can pretty much do anything he wants. Straight away, that is a terrifying concept. What I also love is just how that plays into the kids of Elm Street. Throughout the movie too, the kids of Elm Street continuously tell their parents they are not going to wake up from their dreams, and the parents just constantly ignore them. I've always kind of looked at that as a metaphor of really teenagers not being heard, especially when they're going through really traumatic times and suicidal thoughts. Now you can look into that multitude of different ways, and if you want, just look at it as what Craven put on screen, that Freddy Krueger is this child molester. He has these connections to the kids and he is out to murder them. The parents throughout the entire movie do not believe him, so it does kind of leave the kids stranded by themselves to fight back against Freddy. Now at the same time, if you look at Scream, they took a much different approach where they actually dissected horror movies, and honestly the film itself is made for horror fans. They poke fun at the genre itself, but they also introduce new audiences in really clever ways. With Scream, we follow Sidney Prescott. She battles Ghostface along with her friends by answering a lot of different horror related questions. So I do think, yes, the movie is definitely made for horror fans, but it's a great introduction to anyone that really doesn't know too much about horror. It also has more of a comedy factor to it, where they actually mix comedy and horror extremely well. As for how the story progresses and really what we see the killers do, I thought it was quite smart. There's a lot of twists and turns, and again, if you know your horror movies, you think you know what's coming, and it always surprises you throughout. Overall, with both movies, I think Scream was quite clever in the way it just dissects horror movies and where the genre was at that time, but with A Nightmare on Elm Street, it did something a little bit different for 1984. Up until that point, we'd seen a lot of big burly killers like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, and A Nightmare on Elm Street was just something much different. So with the story of both movies, I'm going to give the first point to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Next up is the characters of both movies. So looking at A Nightmare on Elm Street, there's a lot of great characters in this one, and what I actually like is they are all really relatable and honestly characters you would be friends with in real life. As for Nancy Thompson, the final girl of the movie, she is unlike any other final girl we'd gotten up until that point. Before that, we definitely had a lot of final girls in Laurie Strode or Janet Leigh in Psycho, who did definitely fight back against the killer, but they only really did it when they needed to. With Nancy Thompson, she kind of goes out of her way to really find Freddy Krueger, to take him on, and even set up booby traps all over her house. She's a fighter through and through the entire movie, but you can kind of say that for most of the characters in this one. Even Tina, she's kind of set up at the start of the movie to really be the final girl, and they pull a twist about 20 minutes in where she gets killed off. But she is set up to be a final girl, as she really wants to survive Freddy and fight back against him. When we look at Scream, the characters, they definitely do fall into more stereotypical roles, but what I like about them is they are horror fans. They kind of know the rules of horror, and that's what they use to survive the movie. They also know not to make certain mistakes throughout the film. They know the rules of the slasher genre, and just as a horror fan, it really is a lot easier to identify with those characters. There's also a huge cast in Scream, so there's a lot of characters you're trying to guess who the killer is, but there's also a lot of characters you want to see survive. So characters like Gale and Dewey are kind of in there with the kids of Scream just to kind of mix it up and have adults and kids together. But you also of course have Sidney Prescott, in my opinion the definitive final girl in horror movies. Sidney goes through hell throughout the entire movie, but what I like about her character is actually that she has a lot of baggage at the start of the movie. She's already kind of gone through this whole ordeal with her mother being murdered a year earlier, and it's just a great way to connect the character to Ghostface. She also fights back multiple times throughout the entire movie, where she is constantly trying to survive. What I like about the character mainly is that she is again relatable. With Nancy Thompson, she kind of has a coldness to her throughout the movie, although she's a fighter, and I definitely love that character. There's something about Sidney Prescott where you want to see her be okay. You kind of want to root for her character and genuinely see her get to the end of the film. It reminded me a lot of Laurie Strode in Halloween and what John Carpenter wanted to do with that character. With Sidney, although yes, she becomes more and more of a fighter as the sequels go on, she always has that right from the first movie. So with both of these options, with the characters themselves, I'm going to give the second point to Scream. Next, let's look at the villains of both movies. So Freddy Krueger pretty much did what no other horror villain had done before. He kind of broke the movie and horror itself into the mainstream, and that's because he was both terrifying but also quite funny throughout each of his movies. Although the first movie he does focus more on the terrifying aspect, I think that's what works best for him. He still has a few comedy jabs in there throughout the film. But what I like about him is his connection to the Elm Street kids, and honestly that he has control throughout the whole movie. He pretty much controls the dream world and what happens when you are asleep. As a villain goes, he's by far one of the most terrifying because there's really no way to beat him because you are in his domain. You can't not go to sleep, so anytime you fall asleep you are right there and Freddy is coming for you. Even his look, that red and green sweater with his hat on top, is very iconic, and again it's very unique to who he is. Up until that point there was a lot of kind of walking zombie type characters and a lot of copycats of Halloween. Freddy did something much different where we had a villain number one who spoke but also was terrifying in a much different way. At the same time, Scream did something very similar with Ghostface. In the mid-90s, people were getting a bit bored with the killers that were coming out. The slasher genre in itself was dying a very slow death, and along came Ghostface. They are much different in that they are two regular human killers. They play with the audience with their knowledge of horror, and they move a lot differently. Ghostface is very unique in how they look. They're essentially just two teenage boys out to get revenge and murder everyone in sight. Although they're not as terrifying or villainous as Freddy Krueger, they are still pretty iconic in their own way. But if I had to put both killers up against each other, Freddy Krueger easily gets the point. Next, let's look at the directing of both movies. So with A Nightmare on Elm Street, the directing always has this feeling that there's something surreal about the movie. Whether it's shots of Nancy in the bathtub or even her running up the stairs from Freddy, any of the characters at all in the boiler room, or the opening shot with Freddy making his glove. Even Tina waking from her nightmare, just how Craven uses certain shots to kind of put the audience on edge and just make them feel quite unnerved whether a character is asleep or awake. He also sets up a lot of great kills just with those scenes in particular where just from a technical standpoint they are difficult, and it's impressive what he pulled off. One in particular where a character is being killed on a ceiling or another character has blood flowing from the bed and hitting the ceiling itself. For those scenes he pretty much had to turn the room upside down, so as a technical point of view I think the directing was good. As for Scream, it's a lot slicker, the scale is definitely much bigger, and there's a lot of great action sequences. We also have a lot of crane shots and a lot of long steady shots where we just kind of follow characters through different areas. I love a good chase sequence, and I love if you can direct a chase sequence for quite a long time but keep the momentum up. So with both of these options I'm going to give the next point to Scream. We're also going to look at the impact both movies have had on the horror genre. As for A Nightmare on Elm Street, it definitely came out at a time where we had a lot of Halloween and Friday the 13th imitations. Freddy was much different in the fact that he could talk, he played with his victims quite a lot, and he just looked a lot different. That burned, scarred face, the green and red sweater, all of that really helped the character become this kind of iconic character in horror. As well as that, we had the nightmare scenario and the whole concept, where I do think Freddy did kind of bring horror at the time into the mainstream. Scream did something very similar. Horror was dying a bit of a death at the time, and they definitely came around and revitalized the horror slasher genre, but I do think they just kind of brought back slasher movies. It wasn't as inventive or creative as A Nightmare on Elm Street. So with that point, I'm going to give the next one to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Finally, let's look at the kills of both movies. So we have A Nightmare on Elm Street, which honestly has some of the most iconic kills in horror history. We have Johnny Depp's character being sucked into a bed, we have Tina getting thrown around the ceiling, and of course Nancy's mom being pulled in that tiny little glass frame in the front door at the end of the movie. For me, Tina's death is actually my favourite death in any horror film ever, whereas with Scream, although it definitely has great kills, they're just not as memorable. The biggest one is for sure Tatum's kill, where she gets pulled into that cat door and crushed as it's coming up, but beyond that there's not a lot of gory inventive kills. What I like about Scream is just kind of how they build up the scenes. Drew Barrymore's kill at the start of the movie is one of my favourite openings for a movie ever, but as for the kill itself, it's a bit mediocre. As for the rest of the characters, a lot of the times they get their necks sliced or they might get stabbed, but that's about it. They're not very creative and they're just not very inventive. So for the last point, I'm going to give it to A Nightmare on Elm Street. So with the points racked up and each category looked at, I'm going to give the winner to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Overall, I really enjoy both movies. I love Ghostface and Freddy Krueger, but I do think A Nightmare on Elm Street just has a lot more going for it overall. Although Scream did revitalize the genre, Freddy and A Nightmare on Elm Street did something very unique that really hasn't been copied since. Both movies are great in my opinion, but I do think Nightmare gets the win. Remember guys, as well, if you want to see another video like this one, click any of those links down below and I will see you in the next one.